Hey, so doing another video on this, I wanted to clear up a couple things that weren't clear from the last one that I didn't get to or that I had to look up. So first of all, my webcam was blocking up here, so you can see there's edit profile. I actually changed the profile picture earlier, but this is where you sign out. You can just sign back in. With the password I made, yeah. So that's how I was doing that. Sorry if you couldn't see. List items, this is how it works. Manage modules. So list items, let's just create an item. Say, well, we don't have, okay, we have a category. It's called red. We'll say it's in need of inspection, that there's 12 of them. We'll just create an item. Okay, so we made an item. Look at that. This is sort of what it looks like on our end. We've got the this is I guess the content. There's a link here that I made that we were using to have data sheets on the items. There's this thing right here, so you can go and edit the item, update it like that, or you can just click this account update thing, which is actually pretty useful. And you'll notice if I refresh that page, those changes did propagate on the back end. It is actually 13 on the back end now. So how are we doing that? Well, we're calling a service, and I didn't really get to that in the previous video either. But real quick, I also want to show you how we changed the theme real quick. So I go to core. It's actually in server, which is not what you would expect because it is a client-facing change that we make. Views. And then you've got some for errors that happen, and then this layout server view HTML. We did not really change much of anything in here except, I believe, these lines right here, where we imported a different style sheet. So Max CDN Bootstrap is the site we got it from. I guess there's a SHA hash for integrity, and it's a style sheet, whatever. So it just you change this line, the link here. We're using the superhero theme or whatever, and it gets propagated. So if I just want to show you some other options real quick, free themes for Bootstrap. So the themes, ours was superhero, this one. Look at that. That's basically the way it looks like, right? You can tell. But there's a lot of other ones. So cerulean, what does that look like? It's kind of clean too. So we might want to change ours. And it's not hard to do at all, actually. It's very easy to try on a new one. Anyway, that's that. So I showed you the item. You can see it has the red category tag on there. If you click the item, it'll take you to the edit item page. That's pretty much intended. Anywhere on the item except for this little count area. Alright, so I can go to manage users. I can see that I've got this user, that he's an admin. I could demote myself. That probably would not be what I wanted to do. Manage modules. There's this category. I can delete it. Now if I go back to items, you'll see it doesn't have a category anymore. That's also working as intended. Okay, so how do we relate what we're doing on the front end to what happens on the back end? That's kind of a key question here, I think. So let's go to the items module. That's the one I was working with earlier. Client. And so there's sort of a bunch of different things here. There's these style sheets, which are pretty self-explanatory. There's the views, which is the HTML. You'll notice there's views that are only for the admin and views that everyone can see. That's sort of just separated the permissions so that we can see better. Config is also self-explanatory. The controllers are important. So the controllers relate the services to the views, and they're written in JavaScript. So this is the list items client controller. That means it's for this page, right? So it has all of the functions that support this page, right? So there's that VM, and these are the different queries that you can do, right? So vm.items is itemService.query. So query just returns a list of all of the items in the item service. Category service returns a list of the categories, and so on, right? There's VM increment, right? And this function is actually increment or decrement, right? Because you could do a negative number in this function. But when I'm clicking this, it's just calling that function with item, the item that I'm changing, whichever one it is, and then increment is like 10, plus 10, positive 10. And so then it changes the count, it does create or update with the new reflected item, whatever, and then it has a callback function where it calls either the success callback or the error callback depending on what happened, right? The item saved successfully or not, right? So yeah, that's how that works. This is the controller, right? Now you'll see right up here there's these three services: item service, category service, module service. Very important. This is how we actually talk to the backend, right? Because when we when we click a button, it calls this function, which is going to call create or update, but we don't have, that's actually in like the item service or whatever. So we need to find a way to trigger that. So if we go over here to services, let's just check out the item service. So there's create or update, like I mentioned before. So it just sort of, it extends item prototype or whatever, returns create or update. So this update is like, calling the backend function with the HTML or HTTP request that it's supposed to do. It's also got query somewhere, I think, right? Maybe not. Maybe that's just built in. I don't know. So yeah, the resource is at API items item ID, right? That's all of this API subsection of the code is or subsection of the website is like you would hit it with an HTML request. This item ID with that colon in front means it's actually parameterized, right? And I'm defining the parameter there. So that corresponds to the underscore ID field of the item schema, right? We're saying that update, there's 4 different HTTP methods if you didn't know: post, put, get, and delete. So this is an update, and the natural HTTP method for an update would be a put, right? Get would be basically like read-only functionality. Post is like write-only, and then delete is pretty obvious what that's intended to do. So you'll see there's some callbacks for errors and stuff. Yep. Let's check out the categories service. It's going to look pretty similar. There's a couple different things. We have a list that is a get. We have a new, which is a post, and we have a rem, which is delete. So you'll see list, new, and rem, I think, are what we call in, is it? No, it's not actually. Okay, so I think what we call is create, delete, and get all, because this is where I extend it to AngularJS. So Angular, again, is the front-end framework that we use, and so these are the 3 functions that we're going to call within our HTML inline in order to, pass it. It links these HTTP methods to the actual, HTML that we're writing, right? So if I'm going to look at the code for the category thing real quick, and I'm hoping I'll see create, delete, and get all. It might be list, new, and rem. We'll see. In the views, admin, categories. Okay. Gmodel query. So all that's like the front end code. Maybe it's in the controller. I don't know what I'm doing. Controller admin. Yeah, okay, so category service.rem is what's getting called there. And there's that vm.remove function. And so vm.remove is what you actually would have in the HTML then, in order to call that. And so that's the only one that's on the list, is when you remove it. If you're actually trying to create one, you're going to do it from this page instead. I'll show you the difference between that. So this is manage categories. So this is the list page. This is the creator or update page. So 2 different forms. That's why there's 2 different files for it. And then this one's got create, which can call new there, I guess. And that's what that looks like. So again, those 4 HTTP methods, post, put, get, delete, they roughly correspond to create, read, update, and delete, which are sort of the 4 operations that a database is usually going to support. And you have different permissions for that I'll get to, because those are handled on the back end mostly. This is just registering the module subsections, and yeah, I think I went over the services pretty thoroughly, right? I think it's pretty obvious what's happening there. Anyway, don't be afraid to copy and paste some code from this. If we're extending functionality, certainly allowed to do that. The users is similar to all that kind of stuff. There's sort of just more of it, I guess. I think there might only be a few. So yeah, so there's service for changing passwords, service for authentication. This is a service for update password, delete provider, get unapproved users. Yeah, there's a lot of different ones, and they all have different sort of API URLs. So let's check out the backend for items, because that's sort of the easier one. I think it makes a better example. All right, so there's also backend controllers. Models is where we have the database schemas. Routes is where we have sort of the policies, I guess, is where we have the permissions, right? So it's like allow, invoke roles, policies is the method we have. So the roles are admin, super TA, technician, and TA, and it shows like which ones are allowed which things, right? Star means all permissions relevant to that API, and so this is all the logic for is someone allowed to access something. So this is the ternary operator. It says if request users, like this is evaluates to true, then do this, else do this. I think is what that means. So yeah, it sets it equal to guessed if they're not approved as a valid user or whatever. So if they're not yet an approved user, we don't allow any changes to be made on the database. That's the message I was getting. Well, it's a similar message to what I was getting when I was trying to sign in before I approved my account. So then I check for user roles. I check are any roles allowed. So this would be like I for loop through all the roles that a user has, and if they're a TA and a technician only, and they're not an admin, then they're not going to be allowed to change user data, right? Pretty self-explanatory stuff, I think. The code sort of reads naturally. And these are the routes. So this is not that much code actually, but it's very important because it tells you which sections of the API relate to which modules. So if you're on the items.list page and you have any sort of get, it's going to get routed to this part of the API, the part that's items/create, right? And this gets invoked as middleware. So it checks the items policy and it uses the isAllowed function. So this is actually a function that I'm passing in as a parameter here. So all of them have this items policy isAllowed being invoked as middleware before it actually will run any code in this server module, right? Because we're on the server now. All of these are server stuff. So we'll just look at like items list, items create, read, update, delete. All of those we'll be able to see real quick if I go to the controllers, right? Item server controller. So there's ones for create categories and modules too. They're all sort of in the same page, but these ones are for items. So we've got a create, read, update, and delete. And these are in like JavaScript. Pretty self-explanatory stuff. There's some error checking. It's really not that bad. You'll notice we talk in terms of REQ and RES. That stands for like request and result, right? So the request has everything that's relevant, right, to the HTTP request that was being made. It's got like the client data and like the user agent, like what browser the person's using. It's got a whole bunch of other stuff in there that we don't necessarily need. So we're sort of extracting out just that item data field because that's all that's really relevant to us. So then we extract that out from the data that we have available to us, and we call this remove function on it. This is actually like a database function, item.remove, that's being called. And we'll see that I think in the models. This is how you do a query with Mongoose, which is the way that we link MongoDB to our Node.js server code. So this is a Mongoose query. We do item, like big I item for the class sort of thing, dot find. We sort by the date it was created, and we populate with user and display name, I guess, right? Yeah. And then we execute this function on it. So if we have an error, then we're going to return an error message. Otherwise, we're just going to, res means result, right? And so we turn the items that we return from that list function in JSON format. JSON meaning JavaScript object notation. I already went over that. So exports item by ID, right? So request, result, next ID. Next is middleware. The ID is the ID of the item that we were sent in, right? And that's separate from the HTTP request. So we do find by ID, which is a Mongoose, I think, function. We populate, and then execute and return next. Again, middleware function that we passed in. So we're going to return whatever that next function is with the error. So again, you call this function with another function inside it as one of the parameters. I feel like lots of programmers aren't used to that, so I want to emphasize it. Request.item equals item, and then you call the middleware function again, I guess even if this happened or whatever. I'm not sure why. Alright, so that was controller stuff. This is the mailer that we wrote. This handles like the email stuff. I think it just sort of made sense to have it in a separate object, or a separate file or whatever. Let's go to models. This is important. This is like the database schema, right? So item schema is a new schema. We've got, these are the fields that it got. It's got created. Created has a date, and it's set, to default is right now, like when you create it. Title says it's required. It has an error message for if you don't have it. Content, user. You'll notice this is a reference to another schema, so we do schema.object.id, and then a ref to user, which is another one that we will have up here. Again, because it'll be like var user equals new schema, and that's in a different file. So this is how you refer to other objects in the same database that are not type string or something like that. It's how you say this is a user created type. Type number, type string, You can see there's a lot of different options for how you do that. Type.date, type date, date.now. Lots of good stuff in there. Some of this is bullshit. This is for seeding the database originally, I guess. Hopefully we don't have to deal with any shit like that, because this was annoying, I think. Anyway, that's for, again, seeding, putting initial data on the database. Let's go to the user module and see what that model looks like, just because I'm kind of curious. So this is the user model. Like we saw, the other item model was referring to this one. So there's a lot of functions in here that we didn't write that sort of came packaged with it. Validate username, and here's the schema itself. So there's first name, last name. It supports validation methods, right? So it makes sure validate local strategy property means that it has to sort of obey certain terms, right? So it might be that it can only be, well, this is the function itself right here. So if it's not local and it's not updated, or if the property.length is, I think implicit here is if it's not equal to 0, right? Then we'll return true. Some logic like that, whatever. Email, so index is true and true for unique and sparse. I don't really know what that means. It's okay. Unique means username has to already exist, or it can't already exist. That makes sense. It is required. You can't not have the username. The password has a default value of password 123, which is not really secure, but we actually handle it in a different way. what we do is if the user, let's say like I'm an admin on this account, so I can actually do this. I'm gonna even show you. Let's add new user. So this is me, an admin, creating a new user for that user, right? So cause whatever. TA. Let's say he's a TA. This pops up modules taught. We don't really have that though. So it actually generates him a password randomly. It's going to get sent to here, and it generates him this password. It always starts with capital P, lowercase a. There's sort of a bunch of random hexadecimal digits, and I think it always ends with an exclamation mark, right? So that's actually pretty secure, right? So this user is created. Again, the password is stored hashed and salted, so nobody could really get in. He's got a pretty solid password to log in with the first time, and it gets emailed to him, right? This is just sort of a public bullshit email mailbox that doesn't really exist, but is useful for testing stuff. Mailinator.com, I always do it for this sort of thing. But let's say we create a module, mod. I guess that'd be like yellow or something, right? Red and green, but no blue. Yeah. So let's create another user, and say he's a TA, and now this pops up, and so we can say that he teaches the module. And that's associated with him. So he has specific rights to this module now. If he were to log in, he would see like the items that are relevant to it and stuff like that, you know? Sort of just kind of a nice way of doing it. There's a lot more data in here for the users, but I don't really feel the need to go through it. Some of it's pretty much the same. I guess the roles are important, right? So this is actually an enum, a enumerated type, meaning it has to be one of these options. It can't just be like a random string. It's got to be TA, technician, super TA, or admin. Defaults to TA. It is required. Technicians and super TAs had pretty similar responsibilities, so there's a comment in there talking about that. I think they were a little bit different by the end, but policies. So again, this is the policy for admins, so you'll notice it's going to make sure that people are actually admins, right? At least for some of this stuff, right? I don't know. Maybe there's some other stuff going on here. Roles, admin, TA, super TA. Interesting. Well, I know that it does actually work as far as the security is concerned, so there must be something else going on that I'm not seeing. Anyway, what else? Config? I forget what's in here, but we'll see real quick. Okay, yeah. So it checks the approved status. This is where we did that, and it works. That works because we want the user to be approved by an admin before they have database access. I already went over the routes, right? So it uses the admin policy .isAllowed, I guess, instead of the item policy .isAllowed, and maybe that's how it distinguishes between the two. Anyway, I'm not really sure. But you'll see these are the similar routes, right? So we've got a route called API users, and we set just one access point for the get function, right? Whereas this unapproved list has a couple ones. It's got get, post, and delete. The unapproved list being this thing right here, view pending applicants. So if someone who isn't a user comes and clicks the sign up button, they get assigned to this list, right? There's a button for approve all remaining. You can approve users individually with like a check or an X. And so the three functions it supports are get, which gets the whole list of users that are not yet approved. It filters, it looks through all the users in the database and filters out the ones that are approved and only returns the ones that aren't approved, is how that happens. It's got a post for adding a new user, or really for the post is for changing a user to approved status true. So the object it gets sent is the same user basically, but with the approved status field set to true. And then delete is if you reject a user, it just deletes them from the database. that's just sort of an example, so you can see why there's three different puts or three different HTTP methods on this same route, right? So every function that you call from this page is going to use the same, route of on the API of API/unapproved, right? And it's just a matter of which one. If you click this approve all remaining, this is actually a front end function, and what it'll do is call this change to accepted method on every single applicant. That way we can, we handle some of the logic on the front end, and we don't need to put another HTTP method on the same route. It just puts more work on the client and less on the server, I guess, right? Single user routes. So this is, again, this colon means it's a parameter. So for every single user on the database, there's a separate API URL, right? API/users/ whatever that user's user ID is, right? And these are the three functions that are supported. The admin can read it, the admin can update a user's information, and the admin can delete a user from the database. This is a separate route for an admin signing someone up, right? So again, if I go to admin manage users, the reason that there's a separate route is because you do the first three things from this page, you do the other thing from this page. You click add new user, and there's a separate admin/add, and that's why there's another one there. And then you'll notice I mentioned the parameter user ID. You have to bind it to admin.userById, which is a function. User_by_ID is a function that we have somewhere else. So that's why there's that. That's how you do that too, if you have a parameter in your API URLs. And so that's sort of what it is. What we do, we build an API that talks with the database, and that's the server. And we build, front end that has HTML that uses CSS and that talks to JavaScript services through a controller, and that is MeanJS. That's basically everything there is to it. And so I recommend looking around through this code, sort of messing around on the example site, trying to figure out why something happens a certain way, maybe fool around with it a little bit, and then get started making some stuff, because we need to get started soon. And that's all. Bye.